Well, good evening to everyone, and hello to all of you who are here for in person and those that are live streaming. We know that today is a major bottleneck traffic day in New York City, so people are still kind of trying to make their way here. We appreciate whatever effort any of you already made to be here. My name is Todd Jick, and I'm the faculty director of the Reuben Mark Initiative for Organizational Character and Leadership through the Bernstein Center for Leadership and Ethics, and a professor in the management division. Those of you who have had me in a course know that I'm not used to standing at a podium and reading from a script, so this is highly unusual. In a few minutes, I will be seated here with a wonderful panel, and we will get more informal. But what I'd like to do now is welcome all of you to this 2022 Klion Forum, featuring a panel discussion on the rise of politics in the workplace, a very topical area and one that has, I think, a lot of opinions and information to share. Since 1993, the Klion Forum has been regarded as one of the premier speaker series at CBS, and each year the forum features prominent leaders from various industries who are committed to resolving the ethical, social, political, and economic challenges of our time. I'm going to put an asterisk on the resolving. I'm not sure we're going to resolve the issues tonight, but we will certainly speak to them. First and foremost, we would like to thank the Klion family itself, the proud benefactors of this event. The forum was established in memory of the late Stanley R. Klion, who was a prominent executive in residence at Columbia Business School from 1986 to 1994, and served as executive vice chairman and chief operating officer of Peat Marwick International, one of the world's largest accounting and management consulting firms. Although Mr. Klion is no longer with us, the Bernstein Center is fortunate to have the support of his family, many of whom are joining us tonight, multiple generations of the Klion family. Thank you all for being here and for your support. Let me also acknowledge before we get started that before we get to our presenter and amazing panelists, a little housekeeping. This is a PPIL approved event, and for students seeking PPIL credit, please scan the QR code that you see on the screen, or if you are watching online, click on the link in the chat and be sure to fill out your post-event reflection form. All right, now on to tonight's content. Before we go to our amazing panel, we are very fortunate to have one of my esteemed colleagues from the management division, Vanessa Burbano, who is the Sidney Terrell Associate Professor of Management at CBS. Professor Burbano researches the strategic implications of socially responsible and irresponsible firm practices and how they influence employee behavior. However, recently she focused her attention on the very topic of tonight's session, very timely for us, the rise of politics in the workplace and its implications on employees. So the two parts of this evening is we're going to begin with Professor Burbano sort of doing a very lightning round summary of her research. We gave her an impossible task to do it in a few minutes. And then we have an esteemed panel that I will introduce to you. We'll have about 45 minutes with them and then open it up to questions. So we welcome everybody this evening, and we're very pleased to introduce Professor Burbano. And with a click. Click. There you are. Okay.
All right, excellent. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you here today. Great to see some of my current and past students in the audience today. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of a research perspective on this topic of CEO social political activism. So let me start by sort of defining what we researchers or academics who are interested in this topic have sort of defined as this phenomenon that is going to be the topic of our focus today, which is CEOs or companies communicating stances on social political issues that are unrelated to their core businesses. So some of the very earliest headlines of this phenomenon, you may remember back in 2012 when the CEO of Chick-fil-A took a stance against gay marriage. We then saw other CEOs taking stances in favor of gay marriage. And since then, I mean, particularly in the past 3 to 5 years, there's just been this proliferation of companies taking stances on these social political issues. And there's been news headlines related to this all over the place. So you may remember from a few years ago, Walmart taking a stance related to gun control. We had the CEO of Expensify getting involved in politics and telling his customers that they should vote for Biden in the presidential election. We had the CEO of MyPillow taking a stance and saying that President Trump was the winner of the most recent presidential election. You may have remembered recently, Disney's been in the news a lot with respect to its stance with respect to what has been called the Don't Say Gay law. And interestingly, one of the most sort of recent social political issues that has been in the news a lot has been related to abortion and the Roe v. Wade decision. And the newspapers have sort of noted here that communication on this particular issue has been much more muted. So what do we know about the strategic implications of companies taking these kinds of stances? Well, the answer is actually very little to date. It is in part because it's a very recent phenomenon. We just don't have a lot of historical data that us researchers like to use to sort of do robust empirical analyses. It's also important, I think, to emphasize this is a very different construct from, say, corporate social responsibility or ESG, on which there has been much more academic research. So my recent research has actually been focused on this topic, and I've been interested in trying to help answer the question, how do stakeholders, company stakeholders, such as employees, respond to CEO social political activism? In general, I often apply field experimental methods to try to establish causality in relationships as opposed to correlations. And I also try, whenever possible, to examine revealed, actual employee behavior on the job, as opposed to just asking people what they would do, because we know that a lot of times people don't do what they say they will do, or even sometimes what they think they will do. So here's one of my recent papers on this topic, published last year in Management Science. And for those of you who are interested, you can access these papers on my website. But I will give you the very high level sort of summary of it. I conducted a field experiment on an online labor marketplace, Upwork, where I hired real workers to do real work for payment, randomly assigned whether they found out about their employer's stance on a social political issue at the time. And then I observed their actual work behavior, the quality of the work that they submitted, and how much extra work they were willing to do for their employer. And essentially what I found is that if the employee disagreed with the stance that was communicated, there was a strong demotivating effect, both in terms of the quality of the work completed, as well as the amount of extra work completed. However, if the employees agreed with the stance that their employer communicated, they didn't behave any differently from the control group. So there was no motivating effect. These graphs sort of reflect that. You can see that, amongst workers who were opposed to the social political issue, if their employer also communicated that stance, they behaved statistically equivalently to the control, but there was a strong demotivating effect if their position was reversed. And I see the same effect amongst workers who were in favor of the issue based on whether or not their employer disagreed or agreed with their position. This is a recent working paper that is currently under review. It's called When to Talk Politics in Business. This is a mixed methods paper that does formal modeling to sort of predict stakeholder responses to this phenomenon. And then I use a series of experiments to test those predictions. And just the high level kind of results from this paper. So I'm interested in looking at how individuals respond to communication of a stance on a political issue. And I find that the average effects really depend on the distribution of stakeholder opinion. So if your stakeholders are evenly split in terms of who agrees or disagrees with the issue, I find an average negative effect, which is consistent with the earlier paper I just described. If there's a high enough, let's say, asymmetry in stakeholder opinions on the issue, well, then you can potentially benefit by communicating the stance that's in line with the majority. This model also sort of highlights the fact that what this taking stances does really polarizes your stakeholders' opinions about you as a company. So you both create very enthusiastic stakeholders who really like you, and then you also create a set of stakeholders who sort of essentially strongly dislike you. And the proportion who dislike you is greater than the proportion who like you. And so taken together, this suggests that your optimal strategy is going to depend on the distribution of your stakeholders' opinions on the issue, kind of the stakeholders you want to try to influence through this, as well as whether what you're trying to do is sort of increase the average stakeholder perceptions of your company or CEO, versus if you're okay with sort of capturing the enthusiastic stakeholders and allowing the strongly displeased stakeholders to sort of work somewhere else, buy somewhere else, etc. So that was 5 minutes on my research on this topic. There's so much more research to come on this. It's such a timely and exciting issue. For those of you who are interested, you can take a look at my papers on my website, and I will turn it back over to Todd. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Fantastic, fantastic. I'm not going to use it quickly, but that's good. Thank you. Professor Bourbano, thank you very much. Thank you for whetting our appetite on these issues. I thought maybe you would have solved all these issues, but at least you've sort of opened them up for us. And you've raised the question of a range of reactions of corporations to the question of politics in the workplace. And I've used the examples of companies like Shopify and Basecamp, which have actually banned political discussions, if you can ban them, certainly ban them on work time and sort of sanctioning them as one end of the continuum. And the other end of the continuum is Ben & Jerry's, which essentially creates an ice cream flavor for every topic, political issue that's out there. So you've got, on the one hand, a company which bans it, on the other hand, a company which seems to savor every possible political issue, and most companies in between. And they may take positions, as you say, even contrary to each other. And so we have to raise the questions tonight about why is this phenomenon happening? How big a phenomenon is this about politics in the workplace? How is it being managed or led by executives? What are many of the dilemmas and the issues associated with it? And those are just some of the questions that we're going to talk about, in addition to the fact that you have very topical hot button issues like the Roe v. Wade decision, which has triggered a lot of reaction all over the place in terms of corporations. So I can't answer those questions myself. So we have assembled a fantastic panel to help us do that. And I'm going to ask them to join me up here now, and I will formally introduce them. Two of our three panelists have arrived. The third is making their way up Broadway as we speak. There we go. But we are going to start in any case with our two esteemed panelists. I'll start with Emma Goldberg, who's to your far right, to my far left. Emma Goldberg is a writer for the New York Times. I'm sure many of you have read her columns. As a reporter, she covers the future of work and issues in the workplace, like some of the things we're talking about tonight. She's the author of Life on the Line, Young Doctors Come of Age in a Pandemic, which the Washington Post called essential reading. Her current interests also include the Dobbs decision, income inequality, and election security. Please help me welcome Emma Goldberg. Next to Emma is Miriam Warren, who has flown all the way in from San Francisco to be with us today because Miriam is the Chief Diversity Officer of Yelp and Board Chair of the Yelp Foundation. She has helped the company expand its products supporting LGBTQ rights and has become an outspoken leader on racial justice and abortion. Miriam has been quoted in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, and on Good Morning America. Why not? Well, certainly in the New York Times, we have Emma here. About driving social change. And I recommend that you follow Miriam on Twitter and you'll see how active and thoughtful she is. Please help me welcome Miriam Warren. Shortly, we will have Andrea Hagelgans, who is joining us from Edelman, and I will formally introduce Andrea when she arrives here. Are we tracking? We're the third light up Broadway, making our way forward. So you two are fully equipped to start in on this, and I'm going to ask you each to just say a little bit about what brings you to tonight's topic. I did your bios, so we have some obvious connection, but why is it important to each of you sort of personally and professionally? And then let's jump into the topic. Miriam, why don't you start, and Emma, you'll follow.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and so good to see all of you in the audience today. I think one of the big things that brings me to this topic is that I represent a new C-level position that did not exist many years ago, and even some very short years ago. And that is the role of the Chief Diversity Officer, which has a lot of different implications depending on the company that you're in. But in my company, I represent the culture of the company. So my organization inside of Yelp is called the Culture Team. And we work on everything from internal communications to thinking about how our product should best represent various community constituencies, including our community of employees, our community of users, our community of business owners, and so on. And what we've seen increasingly, certainly in the past several years, but I've been at Yelp for 15 years, so I have seen this really develop over time, is that really the social contract between employers and employees has changed fundamentally, particularly in a time when people are being asked to work from their homes. So now their companies, which maybe were a bit more separate, you take a train, you go to an office, you have a desk there, you leave at night and you go home and you have some separation, really went away in March of 2020, as all of you know. And what came in its place is that people were sort of forced to show a lot more of themselves in their average workday, whether that included your children or your pets or your very tiny apartment or all of them. And I think through that process, people have also, especially on the worker side, have said, we want more. If you say you want us to show up with our full selves and now you're in our homes, what we want back from you as a company is increased. And what we want back from you is empathy. What we want back from you is to speak out on issues that affect our lives and our families' lives and our friends' lives. And what we want from you is to really see us as whole people. And I think that's how I come to this discussion today.
Well, you are in a terribly interesting position to be able to speak to these issues from what you're talking about. All right, we'll come back to some of what you're seeing. Emma, what brings you? You're a business reporter. You could cover all sorts of things. You covered future of work, but this whole issue about politics and the Roe v. Wade and the like seems to have also intrigued you. Tell us a little bit about what brought you to this.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be here and with this great group of presenters. I started on my beat covering the future of work at the Times a year ago. And the beat was created a year ago because the rules of the workplace were being completely rewritten with the advent of remote work. And I think we were experiencing this firsthand at the New York Times, suddenly writing articles from our kitchen tables or our beds instead of the newsroom. But it was really felt like a massive story, like over 50 million people were suddenly working from home. And I thought of it at the beginning as very much a business beat of thinking, you know, what policies are employers putting in place to meet the needs of a new moment in the workplace. And over the course of starting to cover this beat, I realized it was really also a political beat, which is, you know, there's so much that's in tumult right now in our political world and socially, culturally, in the world of labor and the workplace, and all of those kind of areas of tumult are colliding into one another, and you know, no one can really stay in their lane, it feels like. And one of the moments when that hit home for me is I was talking with my editor a few months ago, and she was like, "Oh, well, are you down to cover?" Like I heard her say Jobs Day. I was like, "The Jobs Report? Yeah, I could write about the Jobs Report." And then I realized she was saying Dobbs Day, as in Dobbs v. Jackson, the Supreme Court decision. And I was realizing this is a moment, you know, a lot of the country has health insurance tied to their employer. So what the Supreme Court says on abortion really affects how people show up to work the next day, like what benefits they can expect from their HR team. We saw the same in terms of which workplaces would mandate COVID vaccines. So it's really become, you know, we are, I think, living in an increasingly polarized country, and we are living in and working in increasingly polarized workplaces. And it's been really exciting to come into this area of coverage at a moment when we're seeing so many of the old kind of sacred cows taken down. I have a wonderful colleague, David Gellis, who recently wrote a book about Jack Welch that I finished recently and would highly recommend, because Jack Welch was kind of like, you know, like the CEO's CEO, like he created the playbook everyone wanted to follow. And now all of a sudden we're stepping back and saying, you know, how did he contribute to a lot of the brokenness we're experiencing right now in capitalism, in the workplace? Even David gets into in his book disinformation and election security. So all of these themes that we might have at one point felt more comfortable separating are colliding in new ways. And I felt really privileged to dive into that in my work. So I'm excited to be here and discuss it with all of you.
Well, and I hope both of you and Andrew, when she gets here, will have good advice for the leaders of the future in terms of how they're going to wend their way through all this more complicated kind of workplace life, a future of work that's undefined, that's being created as we speak, and all these different kind of polarization phenomena that are occurring. Let's go back to your experience at Yelp for a second, Miriam, and go back to your observation about this. In some ways came out of the hybrid or the remote workplace where people were more exposed and felt sort of more more wanting to either connect to the company or have their own values be reflected in the company. Are you finding that Yelp employees are of similar positions and values, or once they're exposed, they're more synonymous with the country, which is split on these issues? And you're head of diversity, so the question is, are there diverse opinions, or are there more sort of aligned opinions?
Well, I think to answer this question, you'd have to sort of think about like which employees are we talking about. So when we think about our Yelp employees overall, we have seen, in the last few years, a real shift. So not everyone wants to work remotely. And as such, you are seeing people leave the company who want to work in an office every day, which is not an option for most of our employees. And you are starting to see increasingly people wanting to come into the workplace with us for a couple of key reasons. One, because they want to live wherever they want to live. And we are a fully remote company and people can live wherever they want. And I think increasingly, because we see this in surveys of new employees, that they appreciate our stance on numerous social issues. And it's one of the things that has pulled them in. So I do believe that we have a diversity of beliefs and political thought in the company. But I would say that because we have made many of these stances fairly clear where we are on particular issues, I don't think someone would stumble into Yelp at this stage and not know sort of where we stand on an issue like reproductive healthcare access, for
So
example.
this is a little bit of Professor Bourbano's research in terms of, kind of the alignment between the beliefs of the employees and the company itself. So you don't think you would attract employees who would have differing beliefs?
I think we do. I think, though, that they would be aware that they would be entering a workplace in which the company has been fairly vocal on numerous issues. And this is not something that has started in, say, 2020, for example. So I think someone can be very successful in the company and have a differing viewpoint than maybe the sort of Yelp viewpoint. But I think that they would have to understand fundamentally that their viewpoint would be different. And I think there's room for that. And I think that's important. And also, it is unlikely that the company would change its position on many of these issues because they are so integral to our values and also really affect the product that we put out for millions of consumers to use every day.
And I want to come back to that later because I understand that you and I have had a conversation a bit about Yelp, and Yelp has a sort of framework for trying to decide which issues they're going to weigh in on. I'll come back though to you, Emma, in terms of you're not hearing correctly whether it was jobs or Dobbs. To the extent you have looked at companies that have been involved with the Dobbs issue, and we may explore that a little more deeply as well, but just as a first glance, what did you find? I mean, is this what percentage of companies offered the healthcare or began to sort of say we need to have a position on this, and what other companies just said we're not touching that one? It's got too much heat.
I think what is interesting about the Dobbs and the abortion issue is it's one of those issues where you can't firmly put it in the bucket of politics because, of course, it's a polarizing issue. It's a social and cultural issue that's, bred a lot of division in the country for many years. And at the same time, for a lot of people, it's a healthcare issue and it's an economic issue. There's been studies that have shown that people who try to obtain abortions and then are not able to have worse economic outcomes, as do their children. So for a lot of people, it's an issue of health, it's an issue of economic stability, and their healthcare is tied to their employer. So it's an issue that as much as employers would like to say, this is political and we don't comment on politics, if they provide healthcare benefits for their employees, then they have to say one way or the other, will they cover abortions and will they cover travel for out-of-state abortions? And I think what's been interesting in the past few months since the Supreme Court weighed in with the Dobbs v. Jackson decision is there have not been that many companies that have come out and been loud and clear on where they stand on abortion itself or Roe v. Wade or Dobbs. But there have been many, many companies that have said that they will pay for their employees to cross state lines to get an abortion. And, Amazon said it would, Walmart said it would. Those are both a really big deal because they are two of the largest private employers in the country. And Walmart was a lot later to join that group than many others. So I was like calling them every day, basically for a while, like, are you going to do it? And they were not answering my calls. And then all of a sudden, one day very recently. They were like, yeah, we're going to do it. Like, sure. So it's been a kind of slow and steady process of some of the companies that you might have thought would do anything they could to avoid touching the issue, actually coming forward and saying that they were going to wade in. And to a point Miriam was making earlier, I also think that this is a really interesting moment in terms of recruitment and labor dynamic issues, because it's a very tight labor market. And obviously there's been a lot of coverage of the Great Resignation, which has really looked more like a great reshuffling, a great rethink, call it whatever the TikToks are calling it. But I do think that it's a moment in which workers are really able to look for a job that meets their needs in terms of pay, in terms of flexibility, and in terms of benefits. So if they don't feel that their employer is aligning with them politically or socially, or just aligning with them at the very basic level of what benefits they'll provide, then they have the opportunity to switch because there are a lot of openings. So I think the dynamics of the labor market are really favoring workers right now, and that's putting pressure on companies to wade into certain issues that previously they might not have commented on.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because when we talked the other day, you spoke to me from a coffee shop, and you explained today you were in a coffee shop because the New York Times is in a union dispute with its employees, including you as a journalist, and you were not going to go into the office as a result. So the question of, is this a moment for labor, or do we also recognize that the business community and senior executives on the whole are probably more red than blue? And the companies you mentioned are interesting because obviously we're talking about Walmart, that's Arkansas. But when you think about the companies that have the policies you were talking about, are those in blue states or with more blue employees, or what do we see in terms of companies with their main mandate of representing their shareholders and fighting against labor or fighting against workers? Is there truly an inflection point here going the other way?
I mean, look at Starbucks. Starbucks is a fascinating example because they have long held the line that basically they don't need a union because they pay well and their benefits are good. And now workers are saying, sorry, we still want a union. And there's been a massive wave of stores that are unionizing. And we're seeing that in a lot of we're seeing union drives in other areas as well. We're seeing a lot of white collar unionization, nonprofits. There's also REI. Like there's a fascinating range of companies that are seeing union drives that previously haven't. And then even companies that aren't unionizing, workers are still coming out more assertively than I think we've seen in the past. There's a group of workers at Apple that formed this group called Apple Together. And they put out a number of open letters asking for the ability to continue working remotely. And the language I thought was really fascinating in how strong it was, because I think it had the words, "Stop trying to control us," which from a worker to an employer is pretty bold language. And so I think in this moment in which workers maybe hold more cards than they have previously, we are seeing a growing pressure and even expectation that employers are really listening to what their workers are asking them for, and in certain cases bowing to it, even if it makes the management a little uncomfortable. And certainly I am, in an interesting moment in my own workplace as well.
What are you finding, and similarly in terms of Yelp employees, in terms of kind of their pressures on the firm or their expectations, or do you think this is a moment in which the employees sort of are shifting the conversations and shifting the sort of power relationship?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that balance of power has been shifting over time, and we can see it really obviously, just as Emma is saying, is that people have many more options. And particularly with the rise of remote work, they can have those options in a lot more places than they had before. So you don't have to move to the highest cost areas in the country anymore. And you can also, for many folks, travel not just within the US, but you can also be in other countries doing your work as well. And I think one of the things that we certainly see a lot of is just employees being a lot more candid with us about how they're feeling. And I think going back to that, in my work, certainly we talk a lot about sort of bringing your whole professional self to the workplace, and people are really taking that seriously. And by that, I mean, that, mental health is a huge issue for Americans in general. And particularly, I think younger members of the workforce are finding that they want to talk about this.
Which is when and if Andrea arrives here, her study at Edelman basically pointed out the millennials are pushing, and I'm assuming a large proportion of your employees are millennials, are pushing hard for having a political ideology in companies and involving themselves in these kinds of issues. So there is pressure very much coming there. However, we are in a business school setting, and for those who read the Wall Street Journal also have never seen a newspaper. This is what a newspaper looks like. Yesterday's Wall Street Journal said Apple, Disney pressed on politics, and it's an activist investor basically saying, we don't want you involved in politics. We'd like Apple and Disney to be more like Shopify and Basecamp. So how do you react to Shopify and Basecamps and now these kinds of activist investors saying, stay on shareholder value, don't get yourself involved with all this, it's a slippery slope?
I think that is going to be, continue to be a really interesting debate. But what I would also say is that when you think about what generates shareholder value, in some cases, the type of work that is happening around employers taking a stance on a social issue actually provides a lot of brand equity and brand loyalty for consumers. So it is not only employees that we're talking about when a company takes a stance on an issue, it's also all of the various constituencies that patronize that brand. So in our case, it's all of the contributors that write reviews and add photos. It's also the businesses who buy advertising and get noticed by consumers on Yelp, and all of them have opinions.
So you've got you're saying not only employees, but also the users or consumers or various kinds of stakeholders that are also involved with the company are pushing for the same kind of thing. So when I'm sure you were familiar with Shopify and Basecamp, or maybe not this story from yesterday, but your reaction to it is it's naive to think that you can keep politics out, or it's irresponsible to keep politics out. It's part of what a diversity office would be wanting to have, or tell us more about how you would react to those kind of hard line the other way.
I think this idea that that politics are somehow separate from our lives, in the same way that work is somehow separate from our lives. Like, work is a part of our lives, just like commuting was once a part of many people's lives and is less a part of their lives today. And the same is also true for like politics. What are they? They're an amalgamation of things that affect your life. And so when we think about laws and legislation and all of the things that go into politics, they have a real impact on our daily lives, on where we can access, for example, abortions, or what types of benefits we might be able to receive from the government. And so to think that this is somehow separate from people's actual lives, I think is naive, because politics affect all of us every single day, whether you want to talk about it or not.
I guess then the question becomes, and I'd ask both of you this question, and somebody raised it in one of my classes this week, isn't that government's role to look after all these things? Why is it business's role? Business should be looking after.
Because the government's not doing it. If the government were doing its job, then we wouldn't be wading into this. Do I think that it's a great idea that private employers are in charge of your healthcare for most private employees? No, I don't think that's a great idea, but they are. That is the reality. And, there are, in fact, I think this is an Edelman study that came out talking about how, whereas many citizens do not hold a strong belief in and value in their government necessarily, they do still hold that in private sector companies. And so as a result, they are expecting those companies to not only take care of their employees on a number of different levels, but also to reflect accurately their values, because many consumers are interested in patronizing companies that reflect their values and that are doing right by society at large.
So it means the role of business is even more important, in part because government hasn't played its role, and in part because it's well suited to, again, consumers, employees, and other kind of values that people are holding. Emma, what's your reaction to the question of wasn't this supposed to be government's job? Why are we talking about this in a business school?
I think there's been a heightening of political and social conversations in recent years. to which people feel righteously outraged and indignant, and they want to see responses from every area of their lives. I mean, I think that the killing of George Floyd is an example of that. When there were millions of people marching in the streets for Black Lives Matter, I think to a lot of them, it would have felt, just surreal if the companies that they worked for, that they woke up and worked for in the morning, weren't going to comment on what was going on, like in the streets outside and the movement that they were participating in outside of work hours. I think that certain like political and social issues have just kind of expanded and heightened to a degree that it feels to a lot of people tone deaf if they don't hear any acknowledgement from their employer of what's going on. And I also think it's possible that, there's been certain responses that maybe workers wanted from their workplaces for a long time that they didn't feel that they had the kind of leverage to ask for, because I think it's a generational shift. It's a labor market shift. I think people for a long time felt vulnerable in the workplace, or felt they didn't feel they had the ability to kind of agitate for certain responses from management or from employers. And I think there's been, as Edelman studies have shown, there's been generational shifts in which workers feel a lot more comfortable calling for certain, social responses from their managers. There's again been the labor market shifts where people feel like maybe they have more opportunities, and so they can work for a workplace that they feel acknowledges their needs and their values. I think all of these kind of forces are coming together and creating opportunities and also expectations for workplaces to weigh in on certain issues that maybe in the past it wasn't necessarily responsible for them to ignore, but they felt they had the capacity to do so. And again, I think just to go back to, the Jack Welch book, I think there's a sense that the rules of business haven't worked for a lot of people. And so now there's a stepping back and a reexamination of, if certain things haven't been working, why is that? And what can we and should we expect from businesses that maybe in the past they've been able to like duck and weave away from?
So it's very appropriate to have this conversation in a business school setting and with future business leaders, because that's where the responsibility will lie going forward, to assume some of these roles that you're talking about. I think what we have agreed to is there's no doubt that politics is playing a more and more of a role in the workplace, for positive reasons that we wanted to play a role in it, and for the reason that we have no choice but to be involved in it. And in fact, you're suggesting, Emma, that silence, no response to it, is in fact a response, and that will be interpreted badly by a lot of people. So let's now assume it's going to be continuing to play a major role. How do we see businesses managing and leading through this? Because now that we've opened the Pandora's box, we were silenced for many years, was repressed. Now it's there. Now we have a position like yours, Miriam, at Yelp, that's specifically opening up all of these kinds of issues. What are some of the dilemmas for a company like Yelp in having politics in the workplace be a piece of work life and be part of what people have to kind of figure out and sort out together?
Yeah, I think a big one is this negotiation between what your company might speak to its employees about and what it then wants to talk to a wider constituency about. And so I think there are a number of topics that we may have our CEO talk to employees about that we wouldn't necessarily take a public stance on. And I think there is this big question now around, is there anything that's private inside of a company? So if you are talking to your employees about it, is that in effect actually just talking to the whole world because it's so easy to disseminate information that's happening? And so
part of it is whatever conversations are being had in the company, are those not going to permeate outside?
Right. And if that's true, then you certainly don't want to be in a situation where all you're saying about a particular topic or something that's happening in the world is limited to thoughts and prayers. So you really do want to be asking the company this sort of question, which is, where do we uniquely arrive in this conversation? And is there something that we could actually do, or are we just piling on? And I think that is certainly something that management and executives inside of companies have to think about a lot.
Roughly how many political issues is Yelp addressing at any given time?
I think there are always a handful, and then in certain times you have more than a handful, and other times maybe a little bit less. But I think, it's sort of like asking any human being, how many issues are you dealing with in your life? And if it's a lot of issues, which could include a range of, parenthood and civic duty and happiness, as we were talking about earlier, and so many others, the same thing is happening, when you come to work, or when you change out of your pajamas and go into your loungewear and move into, the other side of the kitchen table to start your work. If you
So do you see executives at Yelp in conversations about which issues we're going to put a spotlight on, which issues we're going to put out a public opinion on? And Andrea, momentarily, I am going to invite you. We're very pleased to have Andrea here, who now has discovered every block of Broadway has a red light. So in a moment, we will incorporate you right into the conversation. We've been eagerly awaiting your arrival. But just to finish off this part of the conversation, I'm just curious about that, because there are so many issues. And maybe speak to the framework, because you said you at Yelp have a framework that helps you filter which issues you're going to weigh in on and which you won't.
So first and foremost, we're thinking about our values. So, most companies, most organizations have a set of values, and those values help to guide your decisions in all sorts of different cases. And weighing in on a social issue is no different. So first we would think and look to our values to guide us. And next we would think about all of our various communities. So we would think first about employees. We would also be thinking about consumers. We would be thinking about our advertisers. We'd be thinking about our board, our investors. And then finally, and I think this one really does help you sort of separate things, which is, what does your company uniquely do? So Emma brought up the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. At that same time, many people wanted to support Black-owned businesses, but there wasn't a good way to find them. And so initially you saw in communities all over the country, people creating spreadsheets, like Google spreadsheets, that they would share with their community saying, these are Black-owned businesses that we know about, go ahead and patronize them, which was a great start. But most people aren't going to decide where to spend their money as a sustainable way through a spreadsheet, right? You're not going to go back to that spreadsheet. And we had already implemented a women-owned attribute at the time. And so we knew that we could actually do this. We could allow business owners to come to the platform, state that they are a Black-owned business, and then we could share that news with people all over, consumers all over. And what that led to is us not only being able to surface women-owned businesses and Black-owned businesses, but also LGBTQ-owned businesses and Latinx-owned businesses and so on and so forth. And many of our consumers tell us the way they want to vote is with their pocketbooks. And so they want to vote with the money that they have. And we're giving them that opportunity to be able to find these sort of values aligned businesses. And I would say that third piece, so you think about your values, you think about your various communities, and then you think about, like, what role do we play uniquely in this conversation?
All right, well, that may be, I mean, Emma, I don't know whether you want to comment or whether you're going to give up your space to the great state of Edelman.
Yeah, no, thank you
so much for
having me.
Andrea Hagelgans is here, and we are delighted you arrived here.
Yes.
I didn't do your full bio, so I'm just going to quickly say, as managing partner for social issues engagement at Edelman, works with the C-suite to help companies manage the risks of action or inaction on societal issues. And I'll stop there so that maybe you can kind of come into the conversation. I don't know what you were thinking about in your car service, but what you were itching to say. So I almost would just say, take the floor and say what you want to say. But we're talking about the dilemmas for corporations, and your firm advises corporations on these various issues. So whatever rules of thumb or however you want to enter the conversation, welcome to Columbia Business
No,
School.
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And on a side note, as someone who worked for Mayor de Blasio for 4 years, I have to say being late is one of my biggest pet peeves. So I'm very apologetic about this.
But the United Nations General Assembly is a tough day to try and be on time.
So Edelman, for those of you that don't know, is the world's largest public relations firm, and we put out the Trust Barometer every year. It's been out for 20 years now. We actually have a new cut that just went out today on connected crisis, and it's specifically looking at social issues like these. And what we have found is the demand for employers, for companies to engage on social issues, it's not going away. It is not going to change. We're not going to have this like, oh, this was just a blip. I think there are a lot of CEOs and boards that wish that were the case, but it is not going to be that way, particularly with younger audiences, with Gen Z stakeholders, but also the reality that many constituencies, many people now feel like post-pandemic, I want to bring my whole self to work and I want that acknowledged. And that means I'm going to have perspective on issues. So what we're doing is we're talking to companies, in particular, I'm doing a lot of counseling with CEOs about, as was said previously, about building these frameworks, because it's pretty impossible for you to take on every single issue and still run a business. But at the same time, if there are issues that your employees are particularly engaged on, I worked a large amount on the Supreme Court decision around abortion. Full disclosure, I used to work at Planned Parenthood for many years. And one of the things that we found pretty consistently, starting with the leaked decision, was employees were saying, hey, boss, this is a healthcare benefit. What are you doing for me? What are we going to be saying about this? It did not matter the industry. It did not matter if it was a brand or a financial services company or the most conservative companies you would think of in corporate America. The reality is employees expected their companies to say something to them about it and to think through the issue and have a point of view. And so we work with a lot of companies around developing that framework to figure out when and how you engage, because the ping-ponging around it and the reactiveness is killing a lot of staffers right now internally at these companies. And it's creating really sort of ad hoc approaches. And so that framework is the most critical piece right now.
And I think one of the points, if I recall, in our conversation in preparation for today, is that you did not want companies to sort of fake it, to be sort of performative and say things without really walking the talk. So to the extent they are, it's a requirement, obligation to weigh in on these issues. Your advice to them is fix your own house first or walk the talk first. Tell us a little bit about what you counsel companies doing, because we did have a gazillion statements around the George Floyd time. We've had statements around the abortion issue, and statements don't go very far. My students are very cynical about businesses making statements. The Business
They should
Roundtable.
be. Yes,
So
if they're not doing the action.
how do you help to ensure that it's not kind of a fake or performative art?
Sure. So I think what's really important, what we tell people from the start, is look internally first. So if you are a company that wants to speak out in International Women's History Month and everything else, you better know what your pay equity issues are internally first, because trust me, Twitter will discover it for you if you do not know already. Similarly, yes, there was a lot of performative action. I do think companies have learned, though, in the last 2 years. I have seen an increase where many companies now really sort of start with we know we haven't had a great history on this issue, or we've been too silent. So they might be tepid or scared about how to engage, but they are aware of that, and they are looking to think through the policy changes that need to take place. But, to the point about the Supreme Court and abortion, I saw a number of stories talking about how these companies were not speaking out on this issue. And yes, that is true. There were not many companies that were pushing out massive statements. But as a woman, as somebody who's worked in this issue for more than a decade at least, the reality is I care way more what my employer was doing about the insurance or the travel benefit than I do if they put out a tweet or a press release. And to me, that action of looking internally and then thinking through what employees or whomever, what they need, that is an action statement. Because they are communicating on it. They are not ignoring the issue. And so I think you're seeing a lot more companies look internally. You're seeing this with ESG, with sustainability issues as well. And that is certainly our first big push. I would say the other big takeaway that I would love to leave, since I know I was rushed in, is there is as much risk in inaction as there is in action.
Yeah.
And I think that has been a real shift in the last 5 years, really with the Trump administration and then moving forward. For so many conversations, it starts out with, well, we don't want to get killed online, so we just want to stay silent. And the surest way to get killed online is to be staying silent in many cases now. And so the reality is you need to, if you're at a company, You need to think about the purpose. What is the purpose of the company? What are the values you've already spoken out on? And how do they relate to that issue? And then analyze from there. Certainly know your business risk. Certainly know your political risk. It's scary to be a CEO these days right now in certain states, and with government contracts and everything else at risk. Not saying to minimize any of that, but there's also risk if all of a sudden your employees stage a walkout and your investors are seeing that, or your employees, your top talent, decide they're not going to move to your state because you haven't said anything about what you're going to do for them when there's a social issue that affects your livelihood, affects your ability to be a parent in that state or anything else. And so these are all just things that companies now have to balance.
So your work, and it's consistent with some of the things that we talked about even before you arrived, is really about how to help employers to play a role in this and to do it effectively, reminding them of some of the pitfalls. But you're saying inaction is actually the worst kind of sin, that then they're going to get killed if they're not taking any position. Taking action has its own risks in terms of how many issues you can take on at any one time, what position you're going to take. And again, a little bit of this paradox of, to the extent the nation is split on a lot of these issues, taking a position on an issue, and this is what Professor Bourbano's research in part was talking about, alienates some people who have opinions contrary to it. Mm-hmm. So the advice that you give must be fascinating in terms of how CEOs take it in, because they've got a lot of dilemmas. If they put out a position heading towards one way, they got to be fearful that they're going to be alienating a certain part of their population. What do you say to them?
Sure. So I'm going to use the abortion example because I think that is, for companies that didn't want to engage in social issues, they hit the third rail with that social issue. Let's be real. Yeah. So what we heard consistently, and again, most conservative companies to very sort of liberal, progressive type companies, is very little backlash. And you didn't even see much backlash online when companies came out and said a statement. And I think that was pretty shocking to people. But more importantly, we heard from companies when I would check in with them and say, okay, you've communicated a new policy. How did it go? They would say, even when I got criticism, I got thanked for the transparency. It's the lack of transparency, because if I'm an employee, I want to know what this company stands for, and I can choose to do with it what I want to do with it, but I need to know where they stand. It's when you're wishy-washy and you don't say something, you don't have a POV. And again, having the risk of action or inaction, I actually think they're pretty equal. I don't think it's more risky to be to take an action and all that. But the reality is, if you don't have a POV and you can't say, based on our company values, we believe X, Y, and Z, that's a real problem in this day and age, because people want to know what is available to them and then make their own choices from there.
All right, I just want to do a time check. I'm going to open it up for questions in a few minutes, or we have a little time. So then, Andrea, let me ask you one other question, because you're uniquely situated with your background, because you did work in politics in New York City. We talked earlier about how is it that business has to play this role today? Why wasn't that government's role? And Miriam very crisply said, because government is not doing its job, we're stuck with having to do this, or we want to do this, we want to play this kind of role. But also, you just raised this issue about taking a position. Of course, politicians are very careful about positions sometimes, because again, it's alienating a certain part of the electorate. Are you training business leaders to be more like politicians, or are we training business leaders to be something different than politicians? What is the relationship between sort of lessons from running a government and government dealing with these issues, and lessons for business leaders dealing with these kinds of issues?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the reality is most politicians, you at least hopefully have a platform. And so you know where they stand on an issue. And so what I would say to a CEO is understand what your company believes in, what its values are, what its purpose is, and be transparent about that and communicate that. Because I think, again, it's when it's murky that it becomes a really, really big problem. And the other thing is consistency. People want consistency around these decisions. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, all of these companies came out, made appropriate decisions in terms of their business transactions and the statements that they were going to make. And what we found is about a week later, we started to get a number of calls because CEOs were fielding questions from employees saying, so you spoke out there, but why didn't you speak out on Syria?
Yeah.
And it was, pretty, I think, insightful to a lot of these CEOs that they realized that they have really knee-jerk reactions to these issues and haven't need to think through how to, again, go back to planning around these issues. Midterms are coming up. There's absolutely no reason to, what issues are coming. I mean, we've all seen the ads. We know that these are really big issues. And so you have to be planning for them.
I mean, it's interesting, your example again about companies again having to decide which issues they're going to weigh in on. In part, we talked about the framework before, but also you sort of use the term of the CEO sort of deciding it, and like a politician sort of having a platform. But a CEO is not the only voice of a company. And the question is, are all executive teams going in the same direction on these issues? How does an executive team sort out taking a position if that team itself is split on some of these issues? Is it just whoever is the founder or the CEO makes the ultimate decision? I mean, we have examples like Airbnb and other places that are founder driven that are very active in this space. But there are publicly held companies that have, wide numbers of shareholders, wide set of executives. We would hope they have diverse opinions. How do they sort through this?
So I'll make a plug for Edelman Societal Navigator. It's our tool. But yes, no, we strongly recommend that you have, and I've started to see in the last year, companies do this, committees that really look at these issues. And they need to be all encompassing, because the reality is these perspectives, these issues are, some of them are generational, some are bring in a lot of different experience to them. And candidly, boards are still pretty predominantly, definitely white, pretty male. And so the reality is you need to think about making sure that you have a very diverse room that's thinking through these things, particularly bringing in the employee perspective. If you are trying to hire, if you are a startup and you're trying to recruit, I would bring in a recruiter's perspective as well on these issues, because these are all business decisions that are going to be affected by whatever stance you end up taking or not taking. But what we do as a company, and we do this ourselves for our issues as well, is we identify an issue, we bring the people together, and we put you through a series of consistent questions around key categories, again, around the values of your company, the business risk that exists if you take a stance on something, your credibility in the space as well, going back to that point about not being performative, and authenticity around that. And we put ourselves through a series of questions and then see where we fall out. And we actually do it with a technology, and so it plots it out, which is pretty cool. And it gives you an algorithm, and it tells you essentially whether it's something you should be continuing to monitor but not really engage in, or to the full extreme of this is an important value that you need to be speaking out on. But it's really, really important to have that framework with the different opinions, because obviously if you don't have the right opinions in the room, that thing can be very skewed.
Well, I have plenty more questions here, but I want to give the audience a chance. I'm going to just ask maybe Emma, you want one last question, and then open it up and ask the audience, and I think maybe some of our folks that are online as well, to ask questions. But Emma, you're looking at sort of the workplace and all the variety of issues that are coming down the pike. Business leaders, CEOs have plenty on their plates as it is. There was an article in the Financial Times, I think this week, about the fact that think about a CEO as spinning plates. They used to spin 20 plates. Now they're spinning 200 plates. Some notion of where does this issue of politics fit into the priorities of all the various issues that CEOs are facing? Because to the extent these are complicated decision processes, communication processes, employee engagement processes, all of these kinds of issues. But in the meantime, you got to get a product out. You got to make your quarterly earnings, et cetera. So how do you see these kinds of issues relative to other issues? Proportionalize it for us, the whole discussion we're having tonight.
I think the reality is that none of these things can be compartmentalized, because just so many of the rules about the way that we work and the way businesses are structured have been so scrambled. So, you can't hit your quarterly earnings or anything if you can't recruit the best talent. Like, and you can't recruit the best talent if you're not showing your alignment with the values that they're expecting, or at the very least, providing the benefits that they're demanding. And you can't, you can't have strong culture unless you're communicating to the expectations that people are laying out, that you address certain social and cultural and political issues that are bubbling up. So I think that culture and productivity and recruitment, like all of these issues are just so inextricable. And politics is like a thread that's woven through all of it, because it's something that's weighing very heavily on people's minds. It's something that they're seeing in the news and on social media, and expecting their employers to, like you were saying, just be transparent about. So I think one issue is, for example, with January 6th, like that was a day I felt, certainly as a reporter, but also just as a human, that it kind of felt like a lot of things were grinding to a halt, because you couldn't look away from like the TV, like just to see an insurrection in the nation's capital was pretty striking. And so I think when there was, after that, some attention to the companies that donate to groups that support some of the policymakers or just the groups that were involved in that insurrection, it was very challenging to maintain business as usual unless you had companies answering to the outcry over where their earnings and where their profits were going, and whether they were going to groups like the Republican Attorney General's Association. So I think that it's very hard to keep productivity or culture or any of those things kind of bubbling along business as usual when we're in a moment of such heightened, fractious, just, chaotic goings on in the world. And so I think things just are incredibly entwined. It's not easy to say, we're going to keep our heads down and focus on the work when the work touches on all the ways that we're living right now.
I think you know why we were here this evening, based on what Emma just said. I mean, the absolutely inextricable importance of this, and the fact that you couldn't answer the question like this is the sixth priority, here are the other five that are more important. These are all connected together. I'm going to open it up now for some questions, and I see. Oh, I got. How far do you want to? Let's go right here in front to begin with. Whoops, you're going to come back over here to the front, and then I'll make my way through I see way, and then there's a mic. I'll go all the way to the back next. So where your hand is, you'll be next. Go right ahead, sir.
Thank you very much for the four of you. I feel smarter than yesterday. So thank you very much for your thoughts, all of you. Let me ask two questions in one. Feel free to answer as much as you wish. I'm curious to understand the frameworks that you implement as a CDO or as a consultant on how to select which type of strategy for any particular issue, whether you're going to take a communication strategy, educational strategy, accountability strategy, or sometimes just a symbolic strategy. What's your framework to choose a particular strategy? I'm sure there could be more. And second, if there are any established indicators to measure progress, whether it's a diversity progress or progress on any other issue that probably companies may ask you to help them with. Thank you.
Sure. So I can start.
Start in. Go ahead, Andrea.
So one of the things in terms of the measurement piece, many companies are measuring is their trust, and whether it's internal trust in terms of employees, and then of course external trust. And so even at Edelman, we take the temperature of our employees to make sure we understand both what they are expecting of us as a company, but then also how we are delivering those messages as well. Because again, if you take a position on something, but then never communicate that position internally, that creates a real disconnect as well. And so I think measuring around trust and thinking about that is one piece that's really important for companies to think through in terms of their reputation overall. On the framework question, companies in particular, they're typically, the first call to us is usually for the comms perspective. So they're going to be always looking more in terms of the comms strategy. But we really try to push them more, again, back to that action piece around what is the policy perspective, what is your legal perspective, all of these different things. I come from politics, and to me, working on the policy is actually more interesting in some respects, because that's where you actually see the change that's going to happen. The communications people I think play the most important role in terms of pushing that policy in many instances. But the reality is companies can't think of these things just as communications challenges anymore. They need to understand that these are deep, holistic conversations that need to happen.
Andrea, I'm also going to plug on your behalf the Edelman Trust Barometer report, which came out, the 2022 report. It's fascinating. It's got a lot of the sort of measures and indicators of companies dealing with these issues. Miriam, what's your reaction? I think it's a very good question about, when is this a communication issue? When is this sort of an action plan? How far does this go in terms of, the debates in the company? How do you make the decision about what you're actually going to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually talking about providing an abortion travel benefit is a great sort of way to look at a case where this happened. So, Yelp's health plan has always covered abortion. And in looking at very restrictive laws like Texas SB 8, which came into law in Texas at the end of the year last year, we recognize like, wow, we have about 100 employees in Texas. What are we going to do for them? And so first, it really was to Andrea's point about the policy. So what is the policy going to be? And so as you look at that, there are a number of pieces that you have to sort out. So one is you have to go to the insurance provider to ensure that they can actually do what you want. And if they don't, then you may have to push them or change providers. And then you also need to think about like, how are you going to first and foremost talk to employees about it? And in our case, because we were one of the first companies to do this and talk about it, we released information that we were going to have this benefit for employees even before the leak of the Supreme Court decision. And so what it meant was that a lot of journalists wanted to talk about this. And so it meant that there was also a lot of education that had to be done because many journalists were saying, oh, so you now cover abortion. No. We've always covered abortion. Our health plans have always covered that. And now we are covering the travel that you may need to go from the state that you're currently in, which would ban abortion, to a state in which you could get this medical care. And so when you think about sort of like, what is that strategy? I wholeheartedly agree that first you have to have a policy.
Yeah.
Next, you want to talk to your employees, but very closely after that, if you are going to speak publicly about it, you definitely want to make sure that all of those pieces are clear because, we first talked to the New York Times about this topic and they ran a story. What we didn't expect, or at least I didn't expect, was that then every other major outlet would also want to run a story on this and that we would be one of the first companies to speak out on this. So I certainly never thought when I woke up sometime in April that most of my work for several months would be, or a lion's share of it would be talking to people about abortion. And I think that's just underscores like how dynamic this environment is that we're in right now. That it is changing constantly. And even in your own role, when you are absolutely at the table talking about these issues, you still may not foresee that it will come out exactly as it has. And I think the one thing I can expect in my job every day is that it will be unexpected.
Well, that's an easy guarantee. It's going to be good. You're pointing. There's a hand there. All right, go ahead. Here comes a microphone. Where I see the pointing. Go point right there. Go ahead. Who's ever got the microphone? Yeah, go ahead. You don't have a microphone. You're about to have one. Yeah, in the back. We have one right here. Okay, quick here, and then I'm coming to the back. Let's get it on. There.
Oh, cool. So from my perception, I think whenever an event happens in the news, you often have a few companies that jump, to respond first. They're first movers here. And then after a few days, all the other companies follow. And after a few, like a week or so, your LinkedIn is just crowded with statements that all seem so similar, right? And so I guess I'm wondering, how do you personally quantify or assess the value of being a first mover, when an event like this happens? How do you balance the risk and the advantage potentially of acting decisively and quickly?
Great question. You want to be out front of this or do you want to be a fast follower? Because you just said you were out front.
In this particular case, but I would say that, most of the time you don't want to be out in front just because you want to sort of see how the story develops. But Andrea, I'm sure you have a good sense of this because you advise so many different companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some companies that have a culture where they want to be leaders. If you look at Ben and Jerry's, I mean, they they have built a brand around that. And so it would
And
be.
many flavors. I mentioned in my introduction
Right.
that, have a cause, have a new
It
flavor.
would be bizarre if all of a sudden they were lagging. And I think, that would be their risk if they didn't appear to be sort of front and center. But it's certainly something when we're talking to a company that we like to assess, really ask that question. Are you a company that feels comfortable moving first? Because we can think through opportunities around that and really position your leadership. Vast majority are going to sort of stay in that middle, like you said. And then of course, there's going to be some that sort of lag behind or may never say anything as well. But I agree. It's typically not their aspiration to be first out of the gate, but that so many people now are feeling pressured into it. I mean, you can see sort of the pace of it as well. I mean, when you think about Ukraine, for example, it was within 24 hours all of a sudden that people were really engaged on that and speaking out. So you don't have that much time to lag at this point.
Yeah,
I also
Emma,
think
do you have a view on this one?
I was going to say the industry matters. I mean, I think with the abortion decision, for example, a lot of the dating apps were very early movers on this. And when I talked to some of them, like Match Group and OkCupid, they were like, well, we want people to be able to date. So like, I think that some companies feel like, maybe it's relevant to their industry to wade in.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we're short on time, so let's take your question there and then your question here. I've got at least two short questions, short answers. We'll get two questions in. Way in the back. Do you have a mic? Oh, now it's moved to somewhere else. So
yeah,
wherever I wave, it's just irrelevant. Wherever the mics have gone, that's what counts. So I don't see if there's a light. Whoever got the mic, go to
got
it.
a mic.
And then
Thank
I'm
you.
coming right up front here after your comment. Go ahead.
Awesome. So we've talked about, earlier we mentioned how businesses are having to step up and take a stance because, governments are not taking care of the issue for citizens, right? But one can also argue that that issue of governments not being able to step up and support the citizens has been perpetuated by businesses who do support sort of your more conservative political policies or politicians who perpetuate those policies. So how does a business reconcile, for example, Walmart, right, who probably makes contributions to more, right-leaning politicians? How does a business reconcile, their who they support and their lobbying with like the actions that they're now trying to or being forced to take in order to support their employees?
All right, that's a big question. We're going to take. Who wants to take that about businesses? Also, kind of contributing to various causes and how do they either play both sides of it or reconcile the differences? And then right up here.
Sure.
Next.
In general, what we talk to companies about is, first of all, know who you're contributing to, which surprisingly, some of them do not know who they're contributing to, and make sure you understand how that could have a reputational impact. But, I would say the vast majority of companies that are good at this, one, they know the business reason they're donating to those folks, so they can sort of really, particularly if employees ask, they can reference that. But also they're doing it to both sides so that it doesn't look like it is one side, unless their purpose, again, aligns with, the one side or the other side in the conversation. The idea that that companies are going to cut off these political contributions, I haven't seen it. I don't know if you have at all. I think, January 6th, we saw it for a brief amount of time. And then, for many, it's business as usual.
There's been a number of companies that announced that they would pause donations to RAGA, the Republican Attorney General Association, following the Dobbs decision. But definitely like the norm that I've seen is to say that they donate to both sides.
All right, let me take one last question. Hopefully it's a sort of wrap-up question. So short question and final answers.
Hopefully this would be a very quick and short question. So I'm Lina, I'm from Boston Fed. So as a female economist at the Fed, so I'm very glad to hear this kind of insightful discussion. So I'm just curious, so during your experience, so how this kind of factor of being female employee in the company gonna affect these management policies or rules or the skills to kind of deal with this kind of politics issues? Any kind of case?
Is your question, sorry, could you repeat your question?
in terms of, so just as a female economist, I'm just curious. So, so say, how would the management teams kind of the policy rules gonna differ across like female employees versus male employees
Sure.
in the workplace?
It's a great question. I think in general, again, going back to the abortion discussion, I think most CEOs certainly didn't wake up in April or May and think, I'm going to be talking about abortion today. And, you know, there's a lot of education that came with that. I think female employees in particular have been, you know, just having more voices at the table has elevated a lot of these types of issues and really sort of changed the dynamic around that. I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but welcome others.
Well, maybe we'll take it offline for closing, because I know we're short on time. Could I just ask each of you 15 seconds? Here's sort of future business leaders online and in person here. What's sort of your best piece of sort of insight or advice that you haven't yet shared this evening about this issue, about politics in the workplace and sort of their role in it going forward? A thought, quick thoughts across the board.
Assemble your troops. It's a long road ahead, and you'll need people around you that can support you, and also self-care really matters. So take care of yourself and the people around you, because we're going to be in this for a long time.
You may need a flak jacket along the way too. Assemble your troops.
I would say embrace uncertainty. I think my coverage has shown that the only like stable thing in recent years has been the uncertainty. And I think workers have in many cases appreciated when executives are open about the degree to which they can't predict the future, because nobody can.
Yeah, I would say avoid knee-jerk reactions. These issues are, many of which are emotionally charged. Really think through the data around them and don't make the assumption that we shouldn't speak out on this because we're going to get killed in the media or vice versa. So, you know, really take the time to think through these issues.
We were so fortunate to have these three intelligent, thoughtful voices on these issues that are going to be very much in our agenda going forward. Can we thank our three panelists for a terrific evening? And for the big effort to get here, whether it be local in New York or all the way from California to join us. Thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you again to the Klion family, and we'll look forward to continuing this conversation on campus all year long. Thanks, everybody.